I wanted to mention something very unusual about this weekly parsha, and that is the custom that, among others, Magen Avraham brings, that used to exist in certain Jewish communities, to fast on Thursday of Parshat Chukat, on the 5th day of this parsha. And it was done to commemorate the saddest day at that time for the Jewry in France, when the French government, the Christian government, forced to burn all the Talmuds. They judged the Talmud and found it guilty, quote unquote, and gathered all the manuscripts. This was long before the printing press. And they found all the manuscripts of the Talmud and burned them all, which of course had a tremendous effect on both the possibility of studying when you don't have copies of the Talmud and no possibility to write the Talmud, and also of course the whole procedure for the Jewish people was incredibly painful, when one of the holiest books that we have, besides of course the written Torah, the Talmud, is the second most important book that we have, and that's what people study the most. Today, of course, there is Shulchan Aruch. There are a lot of other books that are incredibly important, but we're talking about the times when the Talmud was, without question, the most important book after the written Torah. Besides, of course, that the Talmud is much larger. The written Torah, most people know almost by heart, reading it year after year. But the Talmud and all the knowledge, all the oral law, it was a tremendous disaster when all of the copies of the Talmud were burned. And the Magen Avraham brings that they asked what's called shalat Xalom, a kind of way they had through a dream, an induced dream, maybe you could call it. They were able to ask a question, why it happened and what happened. And they were told that it has to do, of course, with this parsha, where the para aduma, the red cow, is burned, that somehow the Torah is compared to the red cow here, and the Talmud, the oral Torah that was burned, is related to it, and that it has to do specifically with the day of the parsha. Usually, to commemorate said events, communities would take upon themselves to fast on a specific day of a specific month. But here they were told it has to do with the parsha, so that's why they chose to fast on that day of that parsha specifically. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who was a great Mikubal, the Kabbalist mystic, discusses this whole issue on Kabbalistic level in one of his letters. And basically what it comes out is that this was the tikkun. It has to do in a certain sense when we don't appreciate enough. Of course, I'm not trying to bring here Kabbalistic ideas. I'm not a Mikubal, I'm not a mystic, but at least on the level that I understood, the little I understand at least on this topic, I could say that in a certain sense, when we don't appreciate the Torah enough, this is what happens to us. Now notice, the Jewish people, we call the people of the book, we are the people who learn the most. We were, of course, literate from the time immemorial. It's known that various non-Jewish leaders used to bring a proof that even 3,000 years ago, an average Jewish kid used to know how to read and write. And it's brought from the book of Shoftim, when a Shofet asked, just an average kid found one kid and said, write to me all the names of the elders of the city, and he was able to do it. So he didn't ask him, are you literate? Do you know how to write? This was at a time when very, very few people knew how to write among non-Jews. But the Jewish people, they were always appreciating the learning. They always tried to teach. The teaching of the Torah, of course, is a commandment for every person to teach his kids Torah, and everybody was literate. And in particular, learning of the Talmud was incredibly important and is incredibly important in religious circles. And therefore, when we don't have enough Mesirut Nefesh, when we don't appreciate enough the treasure that we have, then this was the event that happened, the terrible event, that happened in our history. Now, throughout our history, by the way, a lot of times people paid quite dearly for the learning of the Torah. A lot of times they were killed during persecutions for the fact that they were learning the Torah. Now, of course, the truth is one is not supposed to give up one's life, for instance, to save the Torah. But that's how it comes out for a lot of people. There is a letter from a certain person who was publishing the writings of the Vilna Gaon, and some of it got burned, and he writes in a letter, and probably he's sincere, that I wish I was burned, not these writings. Now, this is not to say that this is what the standard halakha is. It's absolutely not so. To save a person's life, we're supposed to break Shabbat, for instance. Even to save a person's life for a few minutes, for a minute, for a certain time, what's called chai shah, even for a short time, if you could save a person so he or she lives a little bit longer, you break Shabbat. But to save the Sefer Torah that's going to be burned, let's say there's a fire, and there is a Sefer Torah, and to save it, you're not allowed to break Shabbat. At least none of the biblical commandments are allowed to be broken. So it's better that the Torah would burn. So it's not really a halacha. And certainly if this person would be asked, right, let me be allowed to be burned instead of the writings of the Vilna Gaon that were never published, the manuscripts of the Vilna Gaon. Of course, he wouldn't be allowed to be killed in order to save those writings. But of course, his words are not to be taken literally, that he wouldn't be allowed to give up his life in order to save the writings. But I'm just trying to say that that's how people felt, sort of. That the feeling was that he said that he would rather have, right, if it was a Gezerah from Shamayim, if it was so that somebody would have to be burned, he'd rather that he be burned rather than the writings of the Vilna Gaon that never saw light. That was a loss he felt greater with his soul. And there are people sometimes for whom the writings become incredibly important. It's like their life. They put so much into the writings that they put. By the way, you know that there was this great Gaon, a great sage that lived about 100 years ago in what's called Dvinsk. It's now called Daugavpils in Latvia. They call him Ragacheva Gaon. His name is Rabbi Yosef Razin, or Rozin, the author of Tzafnat Paneach. So he was considered one of the greatest sages in his time, very knowledgeable person. And his writings survived because basically before World War II, he died before World War II, his daughter came to try to save those writings and send them, and she was able to send them, I think, to America maybe. They were survived somehow in that way, even though she actually died during Holocaust. Now, of course, if she would be asked, if she would ask a rabbi, am I allowed to risk my life in order to save the writings of my father? She'd be said, absolutely not. She didn't know, of course. Nobody knew that the Germans would do what they did. In fact, her own father was interviewed at some point, and already Hitler came to power at that time, and he didn't realize, her own father, he was a great Torah sage, but he wasn't a prophet. He didn't realize what Hitler would do. Nobody really expected that, because generally Germans were very cultured, and people understood there is anti-Semitism in Germany, but they thought that it's over-exaggerated, that to think that the Germany would actually start physically annihilating the Jews, that didn't make any sense whatsoever. It was impossible to believe that this kind of thing would happen. So therefore, obviously she didn't think she's risking her life by staying in Latvia and trying to save her father's writings, but that's how it ultimately worked out. She died, and she was murdered, but the writings of her father, a lot of those writings survived ultimately, and we're learning from them. So I'm just giving examples, of course, not to say, again, the halacha is clearly that human life is by far more important than any kind of writings of the Torah. But in general, in our history, the Jewish people had tremendous mesirat nefesh for Torah, and the Torah was often, at least, thought of, and people felt that it's our life, mamash, and for them the surviving of the Torah was close in its importance to their own survival. That's how it was. So we're the nation that knows what it means to be moser nefesh, and at the times of persecutions, Baruch Hashem, today we don't live in a situation where we're forbidden to study the Torah. There may be some places where people still are risking when they study the Torah. I heard from a Jew from Iran that he told me, a Persian Jew, he told me that his Rebbe sat in jail for publishing some Torah writings. So definitely there are still some places like that today. But the vast majority of Jews today, Baruch Hashem, in So the Soviet Union no longer exists. In Russia, people can study Torah, and anywhere else as well. Obviously, in America, it's all our choice. We could study Torah if we want to. Nobody's going to kill us for studying the Torah. But historically, in order to get to where we are, we had a lot of unfortunately episodes when, in order to study the Torah, there was a tremendous mesirut nefesh required. And on this I'm going to end, and if you like this video, please press like.